We will now begin session 1. So, we are holding the third GCFA for 2 days, today and tomorrow, and we will have a total of 4 sessions. We are having sessions 1 and 2 today, and we will have presentations by 6 presenters. In session 1, after we hear from the 3 presenters, we will have a short Q&A. And after both sessions are over, we will have overall summary and discussion. So we will now begin session 1 on efforts by international organizations to reduce AMR in the One Health approach. And this session will be chaired by Professor Ryu Sang-yeol from Seoul National University, College of Agriculture and Bioscience. Let's welcome him with a big hand.
Three speakers of the first session. The theme of the first session is efforts of international organizations to reduce AMR in the One Health approach. And we have 3 speakers. And the first speaker is Dr. Marcus Lip, who is a Senior Food Safety Officer at FAO. And today, he will talk about why food matters in efforts to control AMR. Let's welcome Dr. Marcus Lip.
Thank you very much. And I'm very happy to be here and really appreciate the invitation to this important conference. And it will be my pleasure to report a little bit on the efforts that FAO does in the area of food and AMR. So a quick introduction to who FAO is, or a recap maybe rather than an introduction. So the Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, is a specialized agency of the United Nations. And our main efforts are all geared towards defeating hunger, direct support to the Sustainable Development Goal number 2. It's our goal to achieve food security for all and to make sure that people have enough access to high quality food for all of us to lead an active and healthy life. So we have headquarters in Rome, we have regional offices, we have country offices in most of our member countries, and you can see the statistics here on the screen. FAO's mission for food safety is twofold. We could have it more nuanced, but let's focus on 2 aspects here. The one is, thank you. The one is to support our members, our member countries, in continuing to improve food safety at all levels by providing scientific advice that is mainly to Codex Alimentarius, but not only. We also work directly with countries and other agencies to provide scientific advice on food safety and to strengthen the national food control capacities, or food safety capacities, all with a focus for an efficient, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable agri-food system. We know we have to transform our agri-food systems. What we have been doing got us to the point where we are at the moment. We have to do better in the future, and that means we have to transform our agri-food systems towards more sustainability, towards more food security, but we have to do that also while keeping our food safe. So focusing on AMR and what FAO is doing on AMR and the connection to food, in particular to One Health, there is, of course, the quadripartite. That is the work of the FAO, of WHO, the World Health Organization, of the World Organization for Animal Health, WOA, or formerly OIE, and the United Nations Environmental Program. All 4 came together and signed a memorandum of understanding. And you see here this picture is all 4 DGs of all 4 organizations at their first annual face-to-face meeting at the heads of the Quad Tripartite last year. No, earlier this year in March, sorry. They issued an outcome of this meeting, and I summarized the 7 key points that the 4 DGs have agreed upon, which all are geared towards prioritizing One Health per se, within the organizations, for the intersectoral collaborations, for fundraising, for action plans. So One Health is a key leading topic there. And food safety is one of the most important, or one of the very important, at the very least, aspects of One Health. Food safety directly impacts our health. Everybody who had a foodborne illness understands that very, very well. We need safe food. We need safe food every day. We need safe food sufficiently. And food safety is a part of the definition of food, and hence at the core, at the bottom, at the center of many One Health approaches. We have to put it on science. Our common frame of reference, our common belief systems is science. That's for One Health, that's for food safety, that's everywhere the same, because that is a common basis that leads to a common understanding. And then there becomes obviously also the political reality in the national context that may need adjustments then, or some variations to make science as relevant as possible within the national context. The Quad Tripartite operates a multi-partner trust fund. It's an intersectoral and a multi-stakeholder activity that leverages the strengths of the Quad Tripartite, namely the convening powers. It supports directly the 11 countries for strengthening One Health activities in those countries, and 6 more countries are currently drafting activities to become partners in these activities. Pardon me. The global quadripartite system on integrated surveillance of AMR and AMU is at the center of many of the activities in the national context, meaning within the countries that are named here, as is monitoring and evaluation. We've heard already earlier, a lot of emphasis is currently on monitoring and surveillance. We need to measure things in order to manage things. That's at least a mantra under which we are all currently working. And so we need monitoring, we need surveillance activities, and all 4 agencies, organizations came together here to do that, to establish monitoring and evaluation programs, and not the least, to establish or help countries establish a legal framework on which any of the AMR work can be rested upon. In many countries, there is no legal framework, there is no legal mandate for inspectors or the health department or the agricultural department to act upon, but specifically for AMR. And so our legal department, FAO's legal department, as well as all the other organizations, works with those countries to adjust and adapt the national situation. And obviously, if we are working in the environment or with an environmental aspect of AMR, reducing AMR, the environment is global. So we can only work there on a global scale, global level governance and advocacy that will then affect us all. It cannot be that only one country does something in the environment and the neighboring country does not do that. It would not be effective. So what does FAO do further, aside from the quadripartite, of course, an active member in the quadripartite? We host the International FAO Antimicrobial Resistance Monitoring System, also called INFARM system. I believe we will hear more about INFARM system tomorrow. But it essentially hosts bacterial species of interest for public health, for animal health, but also indicator organisms, so that we all know where there is a common point of reference, where we can all share data, and sharing is, of course, very important. That is together and based on Codex Alimentarius and also the World Organization on Animal Health. And it complements the activities that you may have known from the tripartite, the AMU-TISA surveillance program there. So it expands on that, it complements that, and integrates this so that we have a global database where we can go to exchange data and get an overview. Similarly, the FAO assessment tool for laboratories and AMR surveillance system, FAO Atlas, it's either a self-assessment or it can be an external assessment on national capacities to perform AMR surveillance, and in the food and agriculture sector, and very specific for laboratories. Monitoring, surveillance, always or almost always means we need laboratory capacities. These analyses are not trivial, the capacities necessary are not trivial, and to ensure that people understand or nations understand their baseline and have a way forward towards improving capacities if and where and when needed. That's the basics of this assessment tool, FAO Atlas. And of course, we have many other country-specific projects that I'm not listing here individually. There are simply too many of those. They are all geared towards enabling good practices, promoting responsible use in antimicrobials, which is the common thread throughout all these activities, and strengthening governance systems, and of course, allocating resources, because while policies are good, while governance mechanisms are good, and laws are absolutely essential, without resources, no activities can follow. And speaking about technical capacities, whole genome sequencing is, of course, one of the main techniques used in surveillance and monitoring for AMR. But not only AMR, it's also used for foodborne illnesses, detection, monitoring, surveillance of foodborne illness, and the #1 tool that is necessary to link patients and foods, so to identify outbreaks, and to localize outbreaks, and to be able to swiftly and effectively counteract any outbreaks of foodborne illnesses, whether that's AMR or whether that's a more classical foodborne disease. WGS, or whole genome sequencing, is of course a technology that is rather resource intensive, maybe not so much in the initial investments, however very much so in the maintenance of the IT pipelines and the data infrastructure that needs to be built up. And it is extremely important that it rests on a framework of intersectoral collaboration, because its true power only comes if data come from the public health sector, from the animal health sector, and from the food sector, and can be combined and can be mapped against each other, and that's where then this technique can truly develop its potential to help improving public health, but also animal health or environmental health. We have had a number of workshops. Here's just one of them. A number of other activities. There is a significant gap still between a high-income country and low- and middle-income country, and in fact this gap is increasing in terms of the competencies of this technology and the ability to apply this technology. From a FAO perspective, we believe that is a concern to us, that increasing gap, because it would mean that there is a technology that is underutilized or maybe not even accessible in many low- and middle-income countries, that is of extreme relevance to public health, to animal health, to human health, and of fundamental need to monitor and survey AMR. No, but it's not just a super technical deep dive on the analytical side. We also look on the agricultural production angle. And here's an example where we held an expert meeting on alternative and advanced feed practices to promote responsible use of antimicrobials. It's all about responsible use from an FAO perspective. We need antimicrobials, and we need to keep them active. And by the way, just for the record, in antimicrobials, we always stress the point that it's not just antibiotics, but at the same level, it's fungicides, it's antifungals. It's horticulture as much as it is the use of those in animal and livestock production. So it is a very, very broad field. We need antimicrobials for human health. Of course we do, we understand that. We need it for animal health, and we need it for plant health. It is very difficult to currently imagine a system where either animal production or plant production would not have access to some of those agents, because they are essential to maintain and achieve the productivity we're having. And I'm not talking about growth promotion, I'm talking about treating and preventing diseases, either plant diseases or animal diseases. And so, yeah, it's all about responsible use from our perspective, and there is much that can be done in animal production through feed and changing and adopting novel feed practices, and we are actively promoting that throughout our member states, of course. So, we have already heard about the Codex Alimentarius, and I cannot talk about food safety or AMR and not mention Codex Alimentarius. Number one, because I work for FAO, and FAO is hosting the Secretariat of the Codex Alimentarius. But number two, Codex Alimentarius is such an essential global element in food safety, and also in antimicrobial. Professor Park already gave us some overview about the work that he led, Korea has led with regard to AMR. But the work of Codex Alimentarius is, of course, a little broader. It includes all possible standards and guidelines and codes of practices for contaminants and food additives and everything else. So it's incredibly pivotal organ, or let's say forum. It's used by many governments around the world as the source for their national standards. It's not necessarily identical adoption of whatever Codex Alimentarius comes up with. However, it is often the source on which national standards or legislation is then formulated. And it is ultimately, part of its relevance is of course derived by the fact that the WTO, the World Trade Organization, has recognized Codex Alimentarius as a benchmark standard within its sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, which means in case of a trade dispute between countries, the Codex standards serve as the common reference point, as the point of arbitration. So Codex has issued a whole series of AMR texts. As you can see here, it has been discussed in the task force for AMR, as led by Professor Park in Korea, over quite a number of years. But it also has been incorporated in the general principles for food hygiene, in the Code of Practice of Good Animal Feeding, and in several other activities, and including some of the maximum residue limits that are driven by considerations for AMR, for antimicrobial resistance. Several committees are, of course, looking at these all, so these are very central texts, and Codex has made efforts to integrate antimicrobial resistance not just in animal and livestock production, not just as the use of a veterinary drug, but also as a far further fetching goals, and I'll talk to that in a second. So here's the guidelines for the integrated surveillance, and this guidelines is of course intended to assist the governments in the design and implementation of integrated monitoring and surveillance programs. Again, here you will see the use of integrated. These surveillance and monitor programs only can fully deploy their potential and ultimately fulfill their goal if they're integrated across sectors, integrated across disciplines. It is not easy to do so. We fully understand that, and it's never easy to collaborate because it's always hard to work with other organizations that may have different goals. However, it is absolutely fundamental and absolutely critical. And we would like to point out that the use of those national monitoring and surveillance programs, as important as it is, should not lead to generate unjustified barriers to trade. So it is a critical element within all the food legislation, and particularly with AMR, to ensure or let's say to uphold both values of Codex, right? It's public health and fair practices in trade. We need both. We need, of course, public health, as we do animal health, as we do environmental health and plant health, but we also need trade health, if you want to make it very One Health specific. We need fair practices in trade. So the other code of practice that is often referenced is, of course, here. And you see you see from the code of from the contents of the code of practice that it extends fully to the consumer. That's not just producers, it's not just manufacturers, it's not just distributors, it's not just legislators. These discussions around One Health and AMR and AMU, antimicrobial resistance and antimicrobial use, must need to include the consumer as well. We cannot solve these problems without the consumer. So all of the work of Codex Alimentarius is resting on one of its principles, and that's science. So the science serves as the common basis. The science is, in almost all cases, developed jointly by FAO and WHO, sometimes by only one or the other organization, but in the majority of all cases, it's both organizations together. And we're both organizations together, FAO and WHO, hosting a series of expert committees. And if our members, meaning Codex Alimentarius member countries, ask for scientific advice that is not covered by one of those standing expert committees, we just hold ad hoc expert committees. For example, we just held 4 in a row on food allergens, 4 expert meetings in a row. Food allergens don't fall under the terms of references in any of those standing committees, so we held them anyway. Our purpose, the demand that is put on us, is to serve our members and to provide the scientific advice necessary. So that's why we exercise the flexibility that's necessary. I'm putting this up here because at least on the top 3, the GCFA, the Joint Expert Committee for Food Additives, the Joint Expert Committee meeting for Risk Assessment in Microbiology, and the Joint Expert Meeting for Pesticide Residues, they all routinely consider AMR. Pesticide residues, because antimicrobials can be used as a pesticide. It's fairly straightforward. GEMRA, the microbiological risk assessment, because, well, it's bacteria that turn resistant that we are worried about. And then GCFA, the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives, which does not only food additives, plenty of those, but also contaminants in foods and residues of veterinary drugs in foods. And is very, very careful assessing, in particular from the latter, the residues of veterinary drugs, but also from food additive perspective, whether there's a risk for driving AMR, for promoting AMR, or for causing antimicrobial resistance through some mechanisms. So these are always at the bottom of all these evaluations, these concerns, and are fundamental to our work to deliver the scientific advice upon which then all the maximum residue limits or any other instruments from Codex will be formulated. And, of course, I must not forget the ACT project. Thank you to Korea for funding that. It is absolutely wonderful, and it is a very important project. We are halfway through the project. We are supporting countries in Asia and in South America with a generous budget as so kindly provided by Korea, so thank you. It is directly aiming at supporting countries, at supporting national context towards the implementation of Codex texts on AMR. So that's the primary focus. Of course, it aids in helping countries to understand and to recognize and understand how to use and implement Codex texts in the national setting, how to translate that. Codex texts are not necessarily always written for immediate adoption. They need to be translated into a national context. That is not impossible, but it requires quite a bit of energy and expertise to do that. Obviously, it aims at the monitoring and setting up monitoring and surveillance systems. and ultimately, we believe, leads substantially to increased the capacities to manage foodborne AMR in the beneficiary countries. So a wonderful project, wonderful example of excellent work to combat AMR. From our perspective, you have heard me mentioning this a few times, horticulture and fungals, antifungals, are an equally important perspective on AMR. So there's quite a substantial amount of antimicrobials are used in horticulture and plant protection. And so we have developed some text, FAO, and that then gives an overview of which are these agents, what are they doing, how do they compare to any of the lists of critical important agents that have been drafted by either the World Health Organization or by the World Organization for Animal Health. But they can also be as an important, some of them can be classified as an important agent for plant health. And plants are still a major part of our food diet, of course. Lastly, the consumer. I've mentioned it before. We cannot ignore the consumer. We cannot set up systems that don't include the consumer and take care and include concerns or needs to be informed of the consumer. What we are doing here is exploring what is called in economic circles the willingness to pay. So how much would be consumers willing to pay in addition for production mechanisms that are demonstrably or allegedly that claim to reduce AMR, the risk of AMR, or reduce the use of antimicrobials. So there is a standard approach in economics that is comparing the stated preferences versus revealed preferences. Stated preferences, what people say in an interview, right? If you walk up to somebody and say, hey, would you pay more for AMR? Reduction of AMR or healthier food, they always say yes. But then to assess what would they actually do if they have to pay for food in a supermarket, right? How do people really behave? And there's a gap between those two. And that's well demonstrated in economy, and that can be explored and to put a value on a consumer's willingness to pay for food raised without antibiotics or with the claim of responsible use of antibiotics. Very interesting work that includes the concerns of the consumer, or at least demonstrates where the consumer's mind is at the moment, and that we may need to do more work to work with consumer groups or reach the consumer somehow to explain why we have to transform our agri-food systems. We have to change our production practices that may or may not have an impact in the final price, at least on some products. So the very last point is substandard and falsified veterinary products. In particular of concern, it's a general problem from an animal health perspective. Our reason why we're bringing this up here is it's a concern with antimicrobials. Substandard means there's not enough of the active ingredient in that formulation, in that drug, but it's not known to the end consumer. So the end consumer treats an animal or a plant then with subtherapeutic doses of a specific agent, meaning the animals don't get well quickly enough, extends the usage time of those agents at low doses, at doses that drive AMR but don't cure as much. That's a huge problem from an AMR perspective because that's the perfect setup to generate resistance. And obviously that's not something we want, and nobody wants that. Falsified veterinary products is of course what it says. So it states, it has on the label it's one product, but in reality it's another product. If and when the economics match, that could be products that actually are antimicrobials while it's labeled as something else. And then it's some mystery powder that works just marvelously well for the farmers and can never be captured under antimicrobial use because nobody knows that it's actually being used, so there's no official note of that. So we are looking at that. In some not too large of a scale, but we are starting to look at that more in detail on the ground in Rwanda, and we're starting to work in Ethiopia, where we have shipped some mini labs, which are little test kits that are fairly easy to deploy and to use, so that some of our researchers can go around to the markets, to local people, to local vet or what are they called? Acro vets, where the places where people get their veterinary medicines, and say, give me some of that, and then test it, what it actually is. So very interesting work, and we're looking forward to getting the results there. With that, thank you so much for your attention. I'm happy to present to you our views of working together for food safety. We hope we can count on all of the international organization, which we're always working together for food safety, of course, but also on the continued collaboration with Korea. It needs all of us to keep our food safe, and it needs even more of us to fight antimicrobial resistance. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. It was very concise and very clear, good speech. And now it's time for the Q&A. And is there any question from the floor? During your, yeah.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I may ask in Korean. Interpreter can make in English.
You talked about horticulture industry, so AMR in the horticulture industry. Well, FAO or IPPC, which organization has the ultimate responsibility regarding AMR in horticulture industry?
That's an excellent question. So FAO hosts the International Plant Protection Committee. The secretariat is organized by FAO. It is a separate, well, I think it's called commission, apologies. It's a separate commission, very much like Codex Alimentarius. It has a separate membership, and most countries who are members in FAO are also member countries of IPPC. However, IPPC, as per the statute of FAO, has its own decision powers. IPPC decides for itself, and it's binding for its members on use conditions for plant protection products. So I think there's an overlap where we can work together. FAO certainly can provide input, which we do, just like Codex Alimentarius Commission. FAO or WHO, although it's jointly organized, neither organization has the decision powers in the Codex Alimentarius Commission. It's members, member countries, or the EU member organization. It's countries or member organizations that decide what the will of the Commission is in both groups. So ultimately, the decision lies with members, always. That's the whole principle in United Nations. It's the principle within FAO. Ultimately, decision power and the consequences and how to incorporate it in national law will rest with the country. However, FAO can advise and can provide advice, which we do, and offer background information, make connections, raise topics like we're doing here with horticulture and antimicrobials, to raise awareness, to stimulate the discussion, and hoping that we can together come to an inclusive decision-making process that makes scientifically sense, that is based on science, yet respects all the national context that is necessary. Does that answer your question?
Okay, one more question from the floor.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor. When you read different literatures, so many researchers are reporting the increase of antimicrobial resistance, and that makes me a little anxious because it seems like all the efforts from the FAO or relevant institutions, they are not working. So I would like to hear from you some success stories so far in the prevention of antimicrobial resistance strategies. So if we do have some of them so far.
Thank you. No, I understand you very well. It is, first of all, it's a scary topic, right? The risk that has also been published, of course, extensively, that by 2050 or by whatever time frame, all the antibiotics loses their effectiveness, and we have to live in a post-antibiotic environment. 10 million deaths by 2050 that Professor Park has shown. All these forecasts are extremely scary. I completely understand that. For me, the way all these development work is that we humans are really absolutely great in linear extrapolation, right? So we can do that very well, and we show graphs all the time. Everybody does that. However, as soon as we start talking about this topic, and as soon as we start taking action on international fora such as this conference, at Codex Alimentarius, at whatever other fora, there are effects. We are already seeing countries reporting a reduction of the use of antimicrobials. I just came from China last week I was in China. I've seen some latest slides from the Chinese government that demonstrated that they are significantly reducing their use of antimicrobials as a growth promoter, for example. So there are good examples, right? One of the problems is that the more we talk about, the more us humans perceive it as an increase in urgency of the problem, because we hear more and more about it. That's not necessarily true, because that whole AMR story and AMU, the usage, that has been built up over years, right? So we cannot get to a point where an industry uses tens of thousands of tons of a product within a month. That doesn't come overnight. That system is created over years, and it will take some time for it to go away. Because all these things are complicated to reshuffle and to undo. But we are well on the way of doing so. Now, whether we are fast enough or not, that's a different story, right? But I do believe that we have to be very, very careful to keep in mind that if we hear more and more information, like we do on this conference, that it's not an expression of nothing is happening. It's an expression of an increased awareness. It's an expression of more actions, because people talk about it, or the desire to do more actions at the very least, if not in reality more actions. And I've told you stuff not that we want to do at FAO. I told you about projects that we're already executing for some years. And so this is already all in motion, and that will then help, right? I don't want to minimize the need to act on AMR, but maybe if you need an analogy, I'm old enough to have been at least adult in the year 2000, and there was this computer bug, the Y2K problem, that computer programs cannot count from 1999 to 2000, right? Because they have only 2 digits for the year, and then it screws them all up, and the banks will not give you money, and everything will go down, and the supermarkets cannot sell you anything. The predictions were horrible, right? The end of the world was near, and we all were back in the Stone Ages, because no computer works anymore. Well, New Year's Eve, 1999, it went to 2000 a few seconds later, and nothing happened, because we had been talking, we had been preparing, and the linear extrapolations that were made a few years earlier, that if nothing happens, it will be disaster, just didn't come true because something has happened in the meanwhile. We may see with AMR something similar, where things are happening. Things are in motion. We may not all see them that crystal clear, but as long as we're talking more about it, we are on a good track. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.